Welcome to the Michael Shermer Show. I'm your host, Michael Shermer. My guest today is Bobby Duffy. His new book is The Generation Myth: Why When You're Born Matters Less Than You Think. This is a great book, great debunking book of a lot of myths about generations. Bobby Duffy is one of the UK's most respected social researchers. He's a professor of public policy and director of the Policy Institute at King's College London. Duffy previously directed public affairs and global research at Ipsos Mori, M-O-R-I, and the Ipsos Social Research Institute, which, among other initiatives, ran the world's largest study of public perception. He's the author of Why We're Wrong About Nearly Everything, which we discussed a couple years ago on this podcast. His research has been covered by the Washington Post, The Economist, Financial Times, Quartz, NBC, BBC, and elsewhere. He lives in London. So this is a really interesting subject of going through the different generations: silent generation, baby boomers, Generation X, millennials, and Gen Z, and what we can conclude or can't conclude about those. There's a lot of myths. The three main points that I take that are presented in the book is that there's three different major effects here. Lifestyle effects, that is, people change over time as they get older. Period effects, that is, things that happen during a particular time of your life that are big, like a war, an economic recession, pandemic. And cohort effects, that leave particular generations imprinted by specific experiences that happen at a crucial point when their attitudes are forming, say late teens, early adulthood. So the problem scientists like Bobby have is that they interact. So teasing apart the causal variables is really complicated. So they have these complex statistical models and regression equations. And anyway, so we get into all that in great detail with lots and lots of examples from different generations and different time periods and talk about that. Then we go through how generations have changed with regard to smoking and drinking and recreational drugs, dating, sex, marriage, divorce, wealth and income differences, especially housing is now a huge problem, but also the student loan pending crisis. Politics, how people get more conservative as they get older, but there's also generational effects and period effects and so on. Economics and attitudes toward different economic ideologies. Religion and how people get more or less religious and how generations treat belief in God and religion. And then especially we focus a lot of time on social media because that's the current crisis, and different generations obviously use social media in different amounts and with different effects, and to what extent we can say anything definitive about what we know about the effects of social media. We're recording this during the week that the Facebook whistleblower came forward and told us what was really going on at Facebook there. So we get into all of that. So it was a great conversation, and as always, if you appreciate the podcast and our work here, this is run by the Skeptic Society. It's a 501c3 nonprofit, and you can show your support by going to skeptic.com/donate, and that's how the podcast is primarily financed. Skeptic.com/donate. Your donation is a tax write-off, as we are a 501c3 nonprofit. All right, thanks for listening. Bye-bye. Bobby Duffy, welcome back to the show. You are a returning champion.
That's very nice of you to say, Michael.
I will have already properly introduced you in the intro, but again, the new book is The Generation Myth: Why When You're Born Matters Less Than You Think. You have a different title in the UK. I never understand why publishers do this. UK and US publishers are fond of titling their books differently. It gets a little confusing.
It does. I'm going to have to explain to people who buy both books that it's the same, more or less the same content. That happens every time.
Yeah. So give us a little brief introduction of yourself, your own life, your own generational life path, and how you got to end up studying this particular subject.
Yeah, so I'm Gen X. So I was born in 1972. So I'm sort of classic Gen X. So we're the middle generation between the two cultural behemoths and economic and political behemoths of baby boomers and millennials. So we get forgotten in a lot of the discussion of generations. So it's kind of ironic that for the past 15 years or so, I've been looking at generational differences. It kicked off really, I suppose, in some ways by Bob Putnam's Bowling Alone, and how powerful a case that made for the generational decline in social connectedness. And then in the UK, there was a book called The Pinch by a guy called David Willett, who was government minister here, who looked at generational differences and economic outcomes in the UK, and just huge disparities and huge differences in life chances based on when you were born, economic life chances when you were born. So what I tried to do after that then is look at the more attitudinal values, beliefs side of that alongside the economics of it. Try to get a bit of a rounded picture on what's really different between generations. And I suppose prompted by those great pieces of work, but then also noticing loads of really bad research on generations, loads of stereotypes and myths and cliches. And that's what spurred the work.
Yes, here's your opening paragraph, which I really like, so I'm going to read it. We are teetering on the brink of a generational war. Wherever you look, generational betrayals and battles are poisoning relations between old and young. Older generations have stolen younger generations' future, while the young are killing traditions that older generations hold dear. Emerging generations of social justice warriors find themselves facing a war on woke. Baby boomers, that's me, are selfish sociopaths, while millennials are narcissistic snowflakes. And then you say, this at least is the endlessly repeated story, but is any of it true? Yeah. So, of course, I love this book because this is what I do for a living, is debunk nonsense. And it's astonishing to me that this particular subject, like so many areas in history and social science and the humanities, have not had the influence of statistical analysis and the analysis of large data sets and so on. They still, all the way up until just recently, kind of were based on these anecdotal or kind of intuitive theories. You mentioned the one by William Strauss and Neil Howe, where every generation falls into one of four types: idealist, reactive, civic, and adaptive. And they go in the same order through an 80-year cycle of crisis and renewal. And of course, there is no test of it. It's just, they just then scour through the historical record and find some patterns using the confirmation bias and motivated reasoning, and they end up supporting their thesis, completely ignoring the counterfactuals. Doesn't anybody get training in statistical analysis and how to understand causality and testing hypotheses?
Yeah, it's very absent from a lot of the analysis in this. And I think the point I make in the book is we've gone in two really bad directions with it. We've got lots of frothy marketing research headlines that claim little tiny differences or recent differences between generations are defining factors for those generations, whether they are supposed to be killing the napkin industry or whether they've killing the diamond industry, or all these small things that try to sum up vast swathes of the population in very small behaviors. Classically, the latest technological platform or games console, is people try to attach to define a whole generation. So that's one bad direction, where you've got these tiny things. And then in the other direction, you've got these massive, almost astrological theories of types of people, where it's more like a star sign than a piece of analysis. And that's a real problem, because it's so, what I try to argue in the book is they're so pervasive, these myths, that while they seemed quite silly or minor individually, when you add it all up, it does change our views and how we interact with people, and it sort of sets a tone for intergenerational relations that is not good, and it has actual consequences. So it may seem like a bit of fun or a bit of speculative analysis, but actually it does set a tone that has real consequences. So I'm trying to it's not just debunking it for the sake of it. I think it has consequence.
Yeah, these older theories that you debunk remind me of like Marxian or Hegelian theories of history, that history flows through these patterns or cycles and repeats, but no one ever finds a causal vector that would cause that. Because of course societies are just people. Yeah. Acting, in their own interest, self-interest, and so on. And you need a theory from the bottom up, not the top down. And again, once you test these things, you see that they're not true, even though intuitively they feel right.
Yeah.
The other statistic you have in the book that was astonishing to me is in 2015, U.S. companies spent up to $70 million on generational advice, with some experts making as much as $20,000 an hour. For example, to be a millennial expert or a millennial consultant. So I presume these are, major corporations that say, we don't really understand millennials, and if we want to sell them our products, we better hire somebody that'll tell us what's a millennial want, as if they can't just do surveys or something.
That's right.
That's astonishing to me.
That's right. That's exactly. It is. I mean, that was great Wall Street Journal analysis, and just a bit of journalism from them looking into this as a phenomenon. And it is what it is. It's effectively the classic sales technique of you create a problem in order to tell people you can solve it, and that's effectively what's being done. These exaggerations do benefit some people because the exaggerations or myths or stereotypes, they benefit people because you create this sense of difference and change, and if you're not with the times, you're going to fall behind, lose employees or lose market share, or whatever it is. But I've got the solution to it because I understand this new, unique generation, and so much of it is made up. And particularly, in workplace, a lot of that kind of analysis and consulting is about how do you engage your Gen Z workforce, and a lot of that is made. All the academic work shows that there's no real cohort differences. Obviously, you have different needs or wants from work depending on your age, but that's always been the case, and it's a pretty constant pattern as you're looking for development opportunities when you're younger and you're looking for more security when you're older, all of those types of things. And there's so much that's made up, and big organizations fall for it. Target in the US had a kind of cheat sheet of how to praise different generations in different sorts of styles depending on their birth year, and you think as basing it on 15 to 20 year birth year gaps is not going to give you a very precise or tailored approach to human resource management. And it is what it allows as well is a little bit of blaming the young, which we love to do. Throughout history, we love to blame the young. So it gives you a bit of license as an employer to say, if you've got a problem with retention of young people in your organization, you can blame them for being weird rather than look at yourself and say, actually, why, what are we doing that's putting young people off? So again, consequences from this misdirection, really. And I love the idea that there's 400 people on LinkedIn who claim they're millennial consultants, which is, again,
400?
Just 400.
Yeah.
400.
Wow.
So we don't lack millennial consultants.
Yes. Well, to the extent that it works, or that corporations think that it works, is probably something like a self-fulfilling prophecy, or maybe a Westinghouse effect, where any kind of change you make has some sort of results, at least temporarily, like the self-help movement. We did a whole issue of Skeptic on the self-help movement, basically debunking it, but showing that when these corporations would bring in some consultant, like a Tony Robbins, to give a motivational speech, and then give them some suggestions that they can make to motivate their sales force. And sure enough, for the first few weeks, the sales force is fired up, and they hammer out more phone calls, they make more sales, and then you get the regression to the mean, and they're back to where they were in a month or two, and then they got to bring the guy in again. So, and our author of this cover story, Steve Salerno, he used to work for Rodale Press, which is a major publisher of self-help books. And he said the number one predictor of who would buy a self-help book was people who already bought self-help books. Well, if they work, you should be able to just buy one. But if you have to keep buying the tapes and and all the motivational posters and all that stuff, it apparently doesn't work, or it works for a few weeks, but not for the reason you think it does. So I have a feeling that to whatever extent corporations say, "Hey, this really worked," that's what they're experiencing.
Absolutely, yeah, it's a great business model when you create your own demand, future demand. That's
right.
That works.
Yeah. So let's talk about we do have concepts of generations. You list the pre-war / silent generation, the baby boomers, that's me. I was born in 54. Generation X, that's you. And then millennials born after 1980. And then Gen Z, born after 1995, or sometimes they're called iGen. So here, let's think about the concept of concepts. That is to say, to what extent do we try to find some common elements or descriptive terms for a category? Here I'm thinking of Wittgenstein's challenge to find necessary and sufficient conditions for any particular concept, chairs or games. I think games was the classic example. Well, it involves physical activity. Well, board games don't require physical activity. Or gaiety. Well, chess, people aren't having fun playing chess. Or you got to have competition. Well, solitaire is a game that doesn't have competition. It involves winning and losing. Well, if I'm just tossing a ball against a wall, that's a game, but I'm not winning or losing. Or involves skill. Well, what about bingo? Or chance? What about crossword puzzles? In other words, there's, his challenges is that there is no common thread. Yeah. We're just making up these categories and using the word. And yet, if I say a game, well, here's another example, the game of golf. A lot of athletes don't think of golfers as athletes. That's not a sport, it's a game. And of course, golfers are not fond of this distinction because they consider themselves athletes. And there was a case a few years ago that went to the U.S. Supreme Court where there was a handicapped golfer, a professional, and he had knee surgery or something like this, and he had to use a golf cart. And the PGA says, no golf carts. You have to walk. Because that's what it means to be a golfer. You got to walk the course. Come on, man. We're not just playing chess here. This is a physical activity. Anyway, he ended up suing the PGA for discrimination, for being handicapped. And I forget how that came out at the Supreme Court, but it brought up this idea of, well, what is this? What's the concept? And how are we defining it? So talk to us a little bit about how we conceive of generations, because we do. They are a viable concept, and yet the difficulty of finding the thread through it, and which categories what criteria we'd use to define that category.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's, I start from the big thinkers in sociology and philosophy who have worked most on generational theory. And that's people like Karl Mannheim, Hungarian sociologists, Auguste Comte, French philosophers, that talked quite a lot about generations. And even for them, generations was seen as generation and generational difference was seen as the key, or at least one of the key determinants of human development. And it's based on this underlying truth, I guess, of or fundamentals of we're born, we live, and we die, but not all at once, not in big chunks. So it's a constant renewal of society as the sort of first part of it. So you've got a constant flow in and out of society. So that's important in its own right. Then the second element of that is that we are formed more in our beliefs, values, behaviors in our formative years, in late teens, early 20s, in that kind of key point. So what you get from that really is that the conditions that are happening in society around the times where you're formed will shape people in different ways, shape cohorts in different sorts of ways. And it's no coincidence that the big thinking on this happened in Europe, mostly in the run-up and then aftermath of the First World War, where a lot of Mannheim's discussion in particular is about how big traumatic events create this sense of generational identity between cohorts, where you've got more in common with the people around you in terms of age, years, and more difference and set up against, in many cases, older cohorts or different cohorts. So it's got these really big ideas at its core about the nature of how society changes and the nature of how we are formed as individuals and groups. And so that's the starting point. So, and what you get from that really is that it matters when you were born. It does matter. But it's only one of three big effects that affect us and individuals and societies overall. That's one aspect of it. And then another aspect of it is life cycle or age effects, that people do change as they age. It's not that once you've gone through your formative years, you're stuck, and that's exactly what you will always think and do. You do change. So you have life cycle effects. And then you do have period effects as a third group, which is things happen, which could be big black swan events like pandemics or economic crashes, or it could be a slow grind of evolutionary change. Change happens over time, and the period effects affect all of us to some degree, different sorts of degrees, but they affect everyone. So it's a rich mix of these different types of effects that really shape both us as individual societies overall, and then how we change, how societies change overall. So that's what I try to look at in the book, is unpicking those effects. And what that means for your direct question on these categories and how do we distinguish them. In some ways, I've got a big belief in the value of looking at things, societies, through a cohort-based approach as part of the mix of those three effects. And that's where these generational definitions are important, I think. And where we've got to really is those 5-ish categories now that we commonly kind of see discussed, where baby boomers is very linked to a big demographic event, where you have got a bigger cohort coming through in lots of countries, not every country, but lots of countries post-war. You've got Gen X, which is much less defined by demography, much more culturally defined as a reaction. A smaller cohort, that is true, lower birth rates during that kind of period, but not demographically defined. And then millennials, which is similarly quite culturally defined and around a particular point in time related to technology, and then Gen Z, which just kind of follows on. So the actual categorizations that we use don't have huge amount of theoretical basis to them. They don't have really clear lines between them. You would say that's absolutely where you should draw the line because of X. Going back to your point about understanding the causal effects of these things. And I suppose my point is that it doesn't worry me massively that that's the case. I still find value in these categorizations as long as you see it as part of this broader mix of other effects that are going on, and as long as you don't get too obsessed about them being determinant and precise, because the boundaries are blurred. Even in lots of the analysis, 1 year can be in one categorization, the way some people look at it, and it'll be in another year. And anyone around the boundaries of the generation is going to share more characteristics with people in each one that they're close to than people in the middle of them. It's a gradual evolution. What I would say is that I find value in. I find out things about society that you can't see in other ways, any other sorts of ways, except looking at this cohort-based approach. And I don't obsess too much about where the boundaries are or what you call them or anything else around those types of things, because all social classifications, much like your example from Wittgenstein, all social classifications are also very blurry and got a lot of judgment in them. Everything from where do you draw lines on social class or income levels, that's a choice that people make. Ethnicity is treated very basically when we do characterizations of whether it's white or people of color. But there's so many gradations within ethnicity and race that we kind of gloss over in that as well. They're all very reductive categories. We've got even gender now, much more fluid and much more varied in terms of how people identify than it was in the past. So I don't think the fundamental issue with generational thinking is to do with that categorization problem. It's much because there's so much strong theory behind it. As long as we don't get obsessed by the precision of it, it's broad strokes, and we shouldn't be trying to overly define it.
I think of it as like overlapping shingles on a roof, in which, or maybe fuzzy sets with thick, porous borders, in which we're looking at average differences between these cohorts, not any one individual. You can't point to somebody and say, oh, well, you were born in 1931, therefore you are X, Y, and Z. That would not be fair. I was, as for fuzzy sets, I was thinking of example poverty. Well, the UN defines it as, I think it's $1.90 a day or less. You're poor. You're extremely poor. I think that's the category. Well, if you make $2 a day, it's not like you're out of poverty, right? At some point, it's just, I don't feel as poor as I did before, and so on. It just scales up very slowly. But organizations like the UN, they have to draw the line somewhere and just say, well, this is what we're going to call it. And because we want to measure it. And so this is the measurement problem, or the difference between science and the law. Scientists can't tell us when life begins for the abortion issue, or when a teenager can really drive a car or drink or go to war. We just make up a category. Okay, it's age 18. That's it, or a criteria. That's it. Of course, there's so much variation in individuals that some 16-year-olds are ready to drive and go to war and vote or whatever, and some 24-year-olds are not.
Absolutely.
So, and the other thing about stages too, we think about stages in life or history that are also kind of subjective, like Kubler-Ross's famous 5 stages of death and dying, as if everybody goes through those stages. They don't, or in a particular order, they don't. But it is a kind of a useful way to talk about the subject. I think it's a heuristic to help us get our minds around a complex issue, something like that. I think that's what you're doing.
That's right. And the differences are so large.
Let's just go over those 3.
Sorry, Mark. Go
ahead.
What you can see, if we were talking about very fine differences between these generations, you would say you'd have a bit more question over it. But the gaps between generations on many of the measures that you look at are so large, which points to the fact that you're measuring something important here, whether it's connection to religion, generation on generation. These are not small gaps that you're seeing, or attitudes to homosexuality in the past, not small gaps between people. So you're not looking for precision so much as it's a very good analogy about these fuzzy sets and broad strokes that you get from this still tell you something really valuable.
Yeah, another example I thought of, The Lancet last week. You probably saw that brouhaha erupting on social media over their cover, in which they described this neglected study of bodies with vaginas. So I tweeted out, if only we had a word for that, what could that be? And of course, they're trying to, be sensitive to trans, male to female trans, who call themselves women, but they don't have a vagina. So it's unfair to say women and just assume they have vaginas because some women don't have vaginas. Well, okay, what does it mean to be a man or a woman then? I mean, these are, again, fuzzy sets, but they're fairly distinct, historically and medically. We make those distinctions, but we want to be sensitive to changes. So an okay boomer like me, who says, oh, come on, there's just men and women. And then, of course, Gen Zers will go, Shermer, okay, boomer, you don't get it. It's a continuum. It's like, well, it's a spectrum. It's a continuum. But what does the word even mean? Woman or man? What is, if you're going to change it so dramatically, then why even use the word at all? And maybe that's the point.
Yeah. I mean, look, this is one of the key themes of the book, is trying to look at what is broadly culture war type issues. We've got a lot of discussion in the UK right now about culture wars, or whether we're importing elements of a US style culture war here. And it's, I guess the thing that I'm trying to get across in the book is that that's utterly natural, that older generations would feel less sure and more uncomfortable about emergent social norms or cultural norms. It's absolutely normal. In fact, if we didn't have that, we would stagnate. This is the kind of great work by Comte and Mannheim, and then demographers like Norman Ryder, who talk about that type of refreshment from new generations as a type of demographic metabolism, where if we all lived forever, we would all stop, everything would stop, and we'd be a stagnant pond, because you need that constant refreshment. So the thing that I was trying to look at in the book is not so much about the issues. The issues change, obviously. The issues change over time. But what I would say is that the gaps between young and old on the most emergent leading edge issues today are no larger than the gaps between young and old on the emergent issues of the past. So, in fact, baby boomers probably more different from their parents on the emergent issues of their time than Gen Z is from baby boomers today. So this is what I would say a little bit, and it's good to get your views on this, is that this is mixing up those three effects. Is that it feels more divided now, and it feels more fractious right now, but that's a period effect. not a cohort effect. This is not bigger differences between cohorts. It's a period effect of we've got a more divisive social media, politics, where we hear more from the extremes, the extreme slithers of either end of this cultural spectrum than we did in the past. It's just much easier. And actually, the whole information ecosystem is incentivized to draw us to extremes, that it feels more fractious now because of a period effect, not because of bigger differences between generations. And again, I think that's really important because we've got this narrative, as you said, from the intro of the book, of social justice warriors or snowflakes against a sort of reactionary group of older people. And it gets incredibly divisive, and people get embedded in proper culture wars where people think the other side is just utterly wrong and can't even discuss these types of issues. And that's where the risk is, where we get into you can't even talk about these things. And that I think it's much more about the environment we're in right now than anything that we should put on a particular cohort, either end of the age spectrum.
Yeah, I think that phrase, okay, boomer, in fact, if I recall, was coined when Barack Obama said something about some woke thing, and liberals were saying, okay, boomer, you just don't get it. You're not a true liberal. And it's like, Barack Obama is not a true liberal. In my generation, he's right down the middle of the bell curve liberal, right? So, that kind of shift. This is so important. Let's just go over these again. You have three effects that interact with each other. Life cycle effects, that is, people change as they age, say they get more conservative or more religious or less religious or whatever. We'll go over all that. Period effects, in which everyone is affected, say, by war, World War II for the silent generation, or economic recessions, say, for Gen X, and maybe pandemics for all of us now, but especially the iGeners. And then cohort effects that leave a particular generation imprinted by specific experiences that happen at a crucial point when their attitudes are forming in early adulthood. That's quoting from you. So it's something like that, almost think of it as that last one, cohort effects, that it's almost like there's an imprinting stage. I was thinking about this with music. My favorite form of music is classic rock. And I was talking to my friend Steve Pinker about this. Oh, yeah, classic rock. He's the same age as me. 10 days younger than me, right? And so, and I think there is some research showing that whatever music you're exposed to between like age 15 and 25, when you're 50, you look back like, oh, that is the great music. That was we just don't have that kind of music anymore. And it kind of feels that. It does feel that way.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, we are more malleable. I mean, there's lots of good studies on the extent to which in brain structures and everything else, we are more malleable in those years, and we do imprint elements of our beliefs, behaviors, attitudes, values in those early years. And it isn't, like I say, it's not determinant. We do change and adapt as we go on. Life stages is very important, but that is important too. So it is a real effect. There is also, there is a social and cultural element to it as well, about what we share with other people. You shared with Stephen about that sort of experience, and that reinforces it as well, where we've got shared memories from those types of times, and that brings us closer together with our cohorts. So it's an understandably reinforced pattern, but it is definitely within that those formative years that some of those things are set, and it goes right into utterly different life courses that different generations have experienced from what was the accepted pattern. So US, the horrible charts in the book on in terms of a horrible story for younger generations who looked like they were just moving up to follow this pattern in older generations of home ownership, where it was each generation, the pre-war generation of silent in the US, and then baby boomers going up to 70-80% of people owning their own home, Gen X just going up, just looked like shooting up, going right up towards exactly that sort of level. And then early 2000s, huge high price rises and all the other effects, wage stagnation, all those things, just deflected them a bit. And then the crash obviously push them further away from that. And then millennials not even getting going. And they are very different life courses after that, with those sorts of fundamentals that you've got, just where your chances of home ownership are utterly set, to a very large degree set by your birth year, where you would have expected a very different outcome. People in same sorts of socioeconomic circumstances, very different outcome if you were born just at 10, 15, 20 years earlier. And that's a problem, because we've got this expectation of generation on generation progress. We're used to that sense post-war of that we can do at least as well, but hopefully better than previous generations. And it's just not been true for recent generations of young people. And that, again, in the book, I do talk a lot about, intergenerational transfer or interage transfer, and how we need to look after young people better. But in some ways, that's only part of the problem, because I'm very connected to my kids and their chances for the future. So it really matters to me that they have a less chance of success than I did. That chance is declining over time, just on probability. So of moving on from where I got to. So it's really a problem of faith in the system, whether that's economic systems or democratic systems. If we lose that optimism for our young people, and that's the major story of generational change in the past few decades. How we've got so used to a sense of progress, and now are coming to terms with the fact that is no longer the case.
Yeah, interesting. That was a disturbing part of the book for me, because as a boomer, I always promote the idea, like Steve Pinker does, and Matt Ridley on your side of the pond. Progress is marches on, and that homes get larger, quality of life increases. We have better medical care, on and on and on. All you got to do is just work hard and be responsible, and graduate from high school, don't have children without being married. Get a job and, keep a job, just like a half a dozen things you could do. And then you too will own a home, and you'll do, kind of march through the stages. And yet you present evidence that is not going to happen for iGen, right? For Gen Z, because of economic changes. Is it because the price of homes, and for that example, has gone up so much more than income, average income?
Yeah, that's
salaries?
A big part of it.
And is that a temporary effect, or you think that could that change?
Changing
the tax policy, or something?
Absolutely. Well, look, my previous book on misperceptions was very much backing that view of we think things are going downhill, when actually looking across loads and loads of metrics, things are much better than you think and are going in positive direction. We've got this bias towards thinking things are worse or going downhill than they really are, and that is true. On this generational one, it's a fairly long-standing trend now, where this life chances have been concentrated among a particular cohort. When you think of wealth in particular, private wealth has grown so much over the past few decades. It's like the economic story of our time relative to income. So it's wealth that really determines how you feel about your finances and your capabilities. But it's almost all gone to older generations. And that's not to say all in older generations, into the baby boomer group in particular, definitely not. There's a definite split within the boomer population as well. So it's got a subset of boomers who have got this big increase in wealth, which is a lot to do with house prices in different countries, including US and UK. Also stock market rises, how pensions have changed, all of those types of things. And there's been lots of aspects of that where political and economic decisions, because of the weight of the baby boomer cohort, have been kind of pulled towards their interests, not through evil intentions on baby boomers' part, but it's just that's how it works in these types of systems. So they've had an awful lot of that. And whereas, lots of evidence on wage stagnation, the younger cohorts coming through, higher debts, student debts included, but debts more generally, and then increased prices, particularly house prices, etc. So and it's been happening for a long time in the US, and it's not just Gen Z who've had that problem. It started bits of Gen X and then goes through into millennials, and and then the pandemic will obviously have, depending on how we come out of that, will accentuate that. But it's not. It is a story of the interaction between when you're born and your economic resources. This is another kind of criticism of generational perspectives. Is a lot of people will say it's nothing to do with generations. That's a distraction. It's all to do with socioeconomic factors. That's what we should be looking at, inequality effectively between rich and poor. But I think the real story now and for the next decade or so is going to be much more about the intergenerational transfer of inequality, because all this money and wealth is concentrated at the top of the age range among a subset of that group. So the resources that your family have are going to be much more important in terms of when that trickles down towards you. It's already trickling down, but when that comes down, it's going to fall down very unevenly across the millennial and Gen Z cohorts as it comes through. So that, to me, is the key thing that we need to watch for. The extent to which some would talk about it, you end up with an incipient caste system where wealth has become much more important, become very concentrated at the top of the age range, and how that comes down to the next generation is going to be incredibly uneven and sets your life chances in all sorts of different ways.
You mean because of the way inheritance works, that parents give their kids most of their money, but they don't give it to other charities or whatever? They give some, but it mostly goes to your own kin and kind. And that's just going to make the divide even wider because of the wealth disparity. In the United States, there's big discussions about the black-white difference, not just in income, but in wealth, home ownership, that kind of thing. Going back generations. And that's kind of the basis of the discussion of reparations. I was also thinking of the student loan crisis, so-called student loan crisis, which it hasn't erupted yet, but it probably will. I mean, that's something like $1 trillion in student loan debt. And the reason for that, why is that? Well, because colleges are so much more expensive than they used to be. I mean, compared to if you take a basket of goods, like a quart of milk and a gallon of gasoline and so on, and have like a dozen things in there, and you look how much they go up over the course of 50 years, and then you see this huge spike for college tuition, and also home. So do you have a sense of why colleges have gotten so much more relatively expensive?
Yeah, I mean, I guess there is an element of the increased competition, tougher and tougher markets for jobs, where greater differentiation between you and the other competitors in the jobs means that the greater value put on distinguishing characteristics like which college you went to, and you get this sort of sense of an arms race of increased qualifications from people. But it's not good enough now to just have a degree. It has to be from a particular place, and that creates that sense of differentiation. It allows those at the top to put their prices up, but then others kind of join that. Then it becomes a bit of a flow when you've got something that's something that you're trying to distinguish yourself on becomes more valuable, and you can charge more for it. That's effectively that the difficulty in the economic market, I think, is a driver for that as a key signal of employability and employability and economic success. So I think particularly, I mean, like this may be more in the UK in some ways, where we've had a huge increase in the proportion of recent generations going to university level of education. You can see the same pressures here about people trying to differentiate their courses and then going on to do further study, where it used to be okay to have just a undergraduate degree, as we would call it, but going on to do a master's or to do a PhD in order to give you that differentiation. I think that's all part of that process of increased competition for progress.
I haven't looked at this. Is there also credit card debt, distinct differences between generations?
Yeah, there is greater private debt, I mean, it's not a key determinant here in terms of generational outcomes. It is much more those big ticket things of student debt. But yes, debt more generally higher, but there's bigger forces underway than. And I think there is a little bit of there's a bit of a risk when we talk about economic outcomes for younger generations, that there's this horrible trope in lots of the not so good coverage of this and commentary on this of blaming young people themselves for it. There's lots of advice columns on what you could learn from your grandparents about good budgeting, and with very terrible advice about giving up your mobile phone or not eating avocados or getting cheap coffee rather than expensive lattes. And all of that is just a distraction from these massive economic forces, because you'd have to save. I think I worked out in the book, it's like you have to save 113 years or something. You have to give up your mobile phone for 113 years to get the average deposit for a home in the US, and it's all of those types of things are an element of victim blaming, which is very common with young, particularly when we're talking about young people. We've got this sense that this generation of young are the most spendthrift and disorganized, but that's always the case. It's always the case that we've got throughout history. Socrates was particularly down on the young generation in 400 BC, but you can trace it through every era where everyone thinks that the current generation are the worst ever. And that's you see a lot of that in the kind of financial judgment on young people running up their own debts or spending too much, where it's just not the real determinant factor here.
Yeah, Steve Pinker's got, in one of his books, he's got a series of quotes of Harvard professors complaining
Yes.
about the students. And it sounds like it was, last year, and it was like 1769.
Exactly.
It's like, oh,
exactly.
okay. Yeah. That's really funny. Well, it's an N of one, just one example, but I have a family member who had to take out a student loan to finish her senior year at university, and I co-signed for the loan as a favor to my family member. So I'm privy to the notices they send out, and this is the most depressing thing. I mean, it's like $650 a month is the payment. And she just can't make it every month. It's like just her income and so on and so forth, just doing the best she can, got to pay her rent and buy groceries and everything else on a normal salary. And so she's paid thousands and thousands of dollars and owes more than she did when she started, like 6 years ago. It's like, what's the end game here? This is a catastrophe.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it curtails people's choices. When you've got that sort of restriction on your finances, then it's
yeah,
absolutely
terrible. Yeah. So, and then before we go through the different kinds of things, dating, wealth, or we just did wealth, politics, economics, religion, and so on, how do you, as a scientist, tease apart the interacting variables? How do you know if you're studying X, that it's a life cycle effect or a period effect or a cohort effect?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, in the stats, in statistics, there are age period cohort models, as it's called, which effectively are statistical techniques that try to unpick those different effects. But the interesting thing is, because age period and cohort are utterly intertwined, in the sense that it's called an identification problem in statistics, because it is, once you know two of those factors, you automatically know the third. If you know when someone was born and their age, you can tell what day it is or what year it is today, or any combination of those types of things. You can work out the other one from knowing two of them, and that means in modelling terms you can't fully unpick it, and you need to make assumptions about at least one of the factors, that this one is stable or it's going in this direction, and you put that into the model in order to identify the effects of the other two. So it's got this sort of lovely conundrum at the heart of it, actually unpicking those types of things. So I don't do that in the book. I plot lines. I plot lines, just simple chart lines over time by generation, not by age. So I track where the pre-war or silent generation are between 1980 and today, or whatever the data range is, and then baby boomers, you plot them alongside them, and millennials, Gen X, Gen Z, all in the one place. So and what you see from that is you can just see with your eyes really what is going on, and to some degree in some time. So if the lines are incredibly flat, so say 80% of silent generation say they got a connection to religion, but that's incredibly flat over time and it just doesn't change, say, then that's a cohort effect. You can see that as something you're socialized into, and you just kind of stick with that. People may flow in and out of feeling religious, but at an aggregate level, it's kind of stable. And then baby boomers are at 70%, Gen X down at 60%, and so on, millennials lower, and Gen Z. And they're all flat. When you look at lots of these lines on religious connection, they're flat. This is not something that changes as you age. It's not something that's affected by particular events or period effects. In particular, it's something that is a cohort effect. And then equally, you look at how what proportion of different generations are a healthy weight over time. And that is very life cycle driven. You can see we just get fatter as we get older. So you start off with quite high proportions in each cohort that have a healthy weight, but then we just slide down over time into a similar sort of end point. There is also a generational effect in there where you can see each generation getting slightly fatter than the one before, but there is very strong life cycle effect where it's just hard to fight your metabolism, and you just kind of go in that sort of direction. And then you can see very clearly period effects where, something happens, there's a terrorist attack and everyone is very worried about terrorism, or there's an economic event and everyone gets very worried about the economy, or more sort of subtle period effects where we all have shifted, all generations have shifted over time in their views of homosexuality, for example, whether that's morally acceptable or not. It's not just one cohort that's moved on that. There's a general cultural change in that. So that's the way I try to do it in the book, not using the models, fancy models, which are quite complicated, but just looking at the trend. And I think you can see it, not all the time, not perfectly, but you can start to understand what's more important here.
Yeah. A couple other examples I was thinking of, like depression babies. Say my parents grew up in the Depression. And so I think 1927, 1931 birth. So, when they're coming of age, they were very poor. And so, fast forward decades, and, when my dad was in his 70s, my stepdad, and then into his 80s, we kind of started having lunch together once a week just to kind of stay in touch and so on. And he would clip coupons for like Burger King to get, like half off on his burger. Well, by the time he hit his 70s, he had plenty of money. I mean, it's like, what are you saving it for? I'm happy to inherit some, but come on, Dad, go spend it. I can't. This is what we do. We clip coupons, right? And my mom was the same way. That's an effect of being raised in the Depression that just doesn't go away on average.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And we've got each generation has those types of effects that stick with them over time. And what's really important to understand, I think what I think generational analysis is future focused, because if you can separate out these effects and you can truly understand what is a cohort effect, what is going to stay with people as they age, that's different from other previous generations, then you have a much better idea of what the future looks like. Even though we're looking very historically at this data, the purpose in the end is to think about the future and what is going to be different as a result of having a different set of people than we did before. And it's inevitably future focused. so you need to understand that. And in fact, I mean, I would go as far as to say is you can't really understand the future unless you know what's truly generational, because things go up and down, things change. But some generational things, like your grandparents, that stays with people. And fascinating to see what the pandemic effect is on generations in particular who are at their formative times right now. That's going to be whether we do have a truly generation COVID coming through is obviously going to be one of the big questions that we're going to face in the next few decades.
I didn't think it was going to happen, but at first, for the first few months, because I thought it would end much quicker, and here we are, still dragging it out. Yeah. A year and a half. It's going to be 2 years. Could be 5 years before, we could have to live with it forever if the mutations continue and we get the variants. But it may not be just like the flu. It may be worse than that, and that could change people's behaviors going forward. One of my favorite observations from Richard Dawkins, among the many, is that I think he said this in The God Delusion, that you could tell approximately down to the decade when a novel was written based on the language they used to describe women, blacks, Jews, gays, and so forth. And I started looking at that when I was writing The Moral Arc. It's like, oh my God, yes, that's right. You really can't tell. And there's certain words that, you and I would just not use now. Yeah. And, but we had to be kind of kicked into it by the younger generations, like, don't use that word. Okay, I got it. And and that would be one of these generational effects that you're interested in studying.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a constant cultural evolution that we go through of how do we talk about things, how do we view different types of issues, and it never ends. And that's a good thing. It may feel, the trouble is when there's a great Douglas Adam quote from one of his books about, anything that you grew up with is normal. Anything that came in, any bit of technology that came in when you were in your teenage years is exciting, and anything that comes after that is wrong or scary. And it's that feeling of discomfort is, I don't know, I'm sort of learning to embrace my feelings of discomfort after doing the book, because it feels like it's part of the natural course of things.
Yeah, so let's, also you mentioned homosexuality. I was thinking that, in the United States, up until 2011, even Obama and Hillary Clinton were against same-sex marriage, at least publicly. Maybe politicians have to say whatever they have to say to get elected, but then that shifted after 2011, and then 2015, the Supreme Court voted to make same-sex marriage the law of the land. And I noticed that conservatives, and especially conservative Christians, just quit talking about it. Whether internally they've changed their thoughts and feelings about same-sex marriage and gays and so on, or have they really adopted it? But in any case, they just quit talking about it. And I think sometimes that's how these issues resolve. People just move on, and they stop agitating about it. And then the next generation or the two down the line, they don't even think about it anymore. It's just second nature. It's like, gay marriage, whatever, dude, I don't care. And, and that would be one of those long-term shifts.
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting. And I've got the chart of that in the book for the US. And it is one of the most remarkable turnarounds in attitudes that I've seen generationally. And it is driven, you can see it, a massive shift across all generations in an incredibly short period of time for these types of cultural attitudes that relate to things that are tied up with religious belief, and very, very remarkable shift led by, the leading edge of this again is the younger generations, but really very big shifts in older generations very quickly. It's quite an unusual one, the specific gay marriage. And there was lots of, people who study marriage and the relationship between marriage and religion and kind of more cultural attitudes. But they were saying, not that long before the big shift, God, I can never see this changing. We're stuck with this attitude, and it's not going to move. And then just 4 or 5 years later, it just took off in terms of acceptability. And it's a really really interesting one of that, the mix of generation and cohort effects, and that very strong period effect. Once you get to a tipping point within a society, how quickly things can move in terms of those social actions.
I have wondered if moral progress is accelerating. So, say civil rights took decades or even centuries, and then women's rights. A lot of the activists modeled their activism after the civil rights activists and used similar arguments and so on. And then gay rights people kind of modeled their arguments and activism after the women's rights and civil rights, and you get kind of a cumulative effect. So that makes me wonder if there's maybe an acceleration of the change, and maybe that's enhanced by social media even more.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I mean, we always feel like we're in the middle of a great acceleration. That's another one of those kind of effects. So more on the technology side, is we always think this is the era where we're moving fastest, and you get great Walter Lippmann quotes and others from the beginning, many decades ago, saying we're just changing too fast and we can't keep up, and socially as well. So you've got
future shock.
Yes, absolutely. So we've always got that sense that we are accelerating, and I think there are good reasons to think there is elements of our information environment that has accelerated in a way that we haven't seen before. I mean, people would argue against that about the extent to which other revolutions in information were just as big. But I think there is something different about the speed of adoption of some of the technologies that are so embedded into our lives right now and have changed our perspective. I would say there is something qualitatively different about some aspects of this now.
Yeah, we're recording this on October 6th. Yesterday, October 5th, was the 10th anniversary of Steve Jobs' death. So Apple had on their website this little 2.5 minute film short about Steve's life and his inspiration. And they showed clips from his early years when he introduced the Mac and the first MacBook Pro and the Apple II and all that. But then they showed him on stage, with the iPod. And then he introduces the iPhone, and he has to repeat it 3 times. It's a phone and it has music in it. And look, it has a calendar. It's and this is just 2007. It's that's so ridiculous because we're just so used to that.
Absolutely.
That does feel like an accelerating rate of change.
It does. It really does. And I think it's a very good case to be made there, because it touches so many aspects of life. It's become embedded in life in a way that, and at a speed that you would say even other really big technologies, or particularly communication technologies, just didn't quite before. And I think we are, with all the Facebook revelations and Instagram revelations lately, I think we're still unpicking what the effects of this are. But it's a huge, huge social experiment that we're doing live, but how we're changing how people interact with each other and how they see themselves, I guess, as well.
Yeah, definitely. Well, also this week, you mentioned Facebook. The whistleblower appeared before Congress yesterday, and of course Sunday night on 60 Minutes, she, spilled the beans that there's a incentive problem with capitalism. That the point of Facebook, it's a for-profit public company. They're supposed to make money and continue to make more money for their stockholders, and they're supposed to grow and so on. And so they're incentivized to drive people to be more polarized because it keeps them on the page longer. And that, she says, is in conflict with our other moral values, in particular, these Gen Zers, especially teenage girls. So this brings me to Jean Twange's research in her book iGen, and then that was picked up by Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff in their book, The Coddling of the American Mind. So here you have this hypothesis that Gen Zers are more coddled. They are kind of snowflakey because of, Jonathan's and Greg's hypothesis is that, this kind of coddling parenting, helicopter parenting, that itself arose because of the crime wave of the 70s and 80s. Those parents then became hyper sensitive about risk for their children, and that led to this helicopter parenting in the 90s, and now here we are with the snowflakes. but I'm not completely
Mhm.
convinced of that. When I meet so-called snowflakes, they don't seem snowflakey and weak to me. They seem pretty strong and agitated and
Yeah,
motivated in their activism. So, what are your thoughts on social media, all that social media, teenage girls today, and so forth?
yeah, yeah. No, it's a great area, and I think Jean's books and Jonathan and Greg's book on coddling are brilliant, incredibly useful in this area, and more, how John and Greg apply that thinking of that sort of therapy culture of protecting young people from harm rather than exposing them to it. That kind of anti-fragile view of Taleb about actually people grow under stress. They don't. You shouldn't be protecting people from all types of stress because you're not helping them in the long run. I think that's great and really really important. But I think what I'm arguing is that, not dissimilar to what you're saying, is that when you look at the data on this in terms of attitudes to risk or attitudes to fear of harm, those types of things, it's not that different between these generations and previous generations. I think, and my experience, particularly on it being based in a university and seeing lots of young people come through, is not of a scared or cowed generation. It is of a generation that are incredibly focused, driven, and for the most part, it just focused on their studies and getting through in order to get a competitive advantage in an increasingly difficult market. And this, I would say, is an element of that point of mixing up effects of between cohorts and period again. As I think a lot of that sense that we have a snowflake generation is driven by a particular subset of a particular type of university in the US and in the UK, and a particular group of people within those that get a lot more attention than they would have got in the past. There was a few years ago at Manchester University, there was one student group of a dozen people banned applause at one of their events because they said the jazz hands movement was more inclusive because people who have autism in their audience find the clapping like bomb going off in their head was the sort of the idea from the student disability officer, and that went worldwide. And you are
Yeah.
thinking, I think you even got Governor Bush commenting on it in a sort of ironic way, but still, and loads and loads of newspaper headlines really pointing out how coddled this generation was, and it's just an incredibly small thing that would happen throughout history in universities, where you've got this leading edge of young people coming through, remembering that the youngest cohort are always the ones that are pushing the boundaries of what is a social norm. And it isn't as different, or it isn't as different as it can be made out, and particularly in the commentary around it and around the cultural aspects of these things. And I think what we have a risk of slightly in overstating some of those things is effectively falling into a trap that we say young people fall into, and catastrophizing a whole generation. That's what I slightly worry about, is if we think about it as a completely a whole, that this applies to a whole generation, which it's often presented like that. It's not only not true, I think, in terms of what you can see in the evidence, it is also a risky way to present a whole generation, because it can become self-fulfilling, it can encourage those types of things, but it also sets it up as a conflict between that generation and other generations. It gives a very easy out to older people to say, this is a weird cohort, and it's them that's wrong, not us. And that is, like I say, that is a constant of human nature, is we're always tempted to say this is the uniquely weird and wrong generation coming through now. more so than any time in history. So we're playing to that type of thing, and all that does is separate people, and that's what I worry about. Because when I see most of these types of things, and you see the different generations interacting in positive ways, there is not nearly as much gap between young and old as the rhetoric suggests. And I think, so I argue in the book that generational conflict is not our problem. It's generational separation is the bigger risk, because we're living physically more separately than we've ever lived before. Young people sorting into towns and big cities, older people in more suburban and rural areas. We've got very separate digital lives now. Older people are more online, that's true, but they're on different platforms doing different sorts of things. So we've got this very important digital aspect to our lives where we're also living separately, not interacting with each other as much as we do. So we've got this massive experiment of separation. And I think the stereotyping adds to that. It both is a result of that in the sense of if you live more separately from people, it's much easier to stereotype them, and if you don't have much contact with them, but also then reinforces that sense of separation when you start to fall back on this whole generation has this one characteristic, and that's different from us.
Yeah, that's back to your Putnam's Bowling Alone, and that was written before the internet, I think. So if anything, it's maybe even more separated. Yeah, I'm kind of conflicted about this. I didn't come of age with the social media and all that stuff. I participate in Twitter, tiny bit on Instagram, not much, and really I hardly even open my Facebook page. I have my webmeister looks at it periodically to see if there's anything that's exploded there. So to me, when I hear these stories, it's like, oh, come on, Jesus. I mean, it's not like nuclear weapons or something. Netflix had that documentary, The Social Dilemma, in which Tristan Harris and a few of the other ex-Facebook and social media engineers, were kind of self-flagellating like they were J. Robert Oppenheimer with blood on their hands because they invented the like button. And it's like, oh, come on, please, just turn the thing off. And like on Twitter, I just don't read the comments. I mean, sometimes I'll look just to see if I'm going to get hammered, but I just don't read them. But then younger people would say, "Oh, come on, sure, okay, boomer, you don't get it. This is important to us. I can't just turn it off. I can't just ignore it." And for me, I'm just used to not having it. So if I don't check my Facebook, I don't care. It just doesn't matter to me. But maybe that's not fair.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is there's a serious issue with mental health and young women's mental health in particular. I mean, that is very, very clear in the evidence. That is, and cuts across countries. We are more or less the same now as the US in the UK. So this is cutting across, and I think looking at how has our information environment, our social media environment, and our technology environment potentially affected that is really, really important. I sort of, in the book, I'm very cautious about the moral panic of saying this is down to mobile phones or social media, because, when I'm writing the book, the evidence is not very strong, and it's still emerging. And even the Facebook and Instagram revelations, they're still these very basic survey studies. There's this truly understanding what is the causal factors here is really, really tough. And we've got to bear in mind our really strong inbuilt tendency to moral panic around any new technology before we jump to conclusions. And it's really important on that, because it's not, again, to protect social media platforms or others involved in this. It's much more about looking in the wrong place, putting all our efforts into one explanation and one solution. Again, another very human bias of wanting to have one single cause as the explanation for something, so then we know what to do. We've got something immediate we can do, and it's probably more complicated than that. But having said all that, there is a real worrying pattern in the fact that this is young women in this cohort. There is a population that does particular things tends to be more likely to do particular things online on these platforms, and their mental health has deteriorated over this sort of period, you do think there's a lot there that makes you think, yes, we should be really seriously trying to understand that, and then act on that too. So it's trying to get that balance right of caution on not jumping to conclusions on this, but also actually looking very seriously at it.
So just to be clear, the problem is that there has been a spike in anxiety, self-report anxiety, suicidal ideation, cutting, and just general angst about your weight and figure and looks and so on. Mostly, it's gone up with boys somewhat, but like triple in girls. Say age 13 to 18 or 17 or something like that, right? So this effect appears to be real, not some statistical artifact. But the question is what's the cause?
That is the question. And
how do we know that? It feels like, I mean, you point to social media, but how do you know that's the cause? Maybe it's, lead in the water. I don't know, something that no one's even thought of yet.
No, exactly. I mean, that's the problem. And there are lots of correlation analysis that would show that there's other factors that are just as related to those types of outcomes, or even more related to those types of outcomes than social media use or anything else. The challenge a little bit is these are not, one-step models of you look at Instagram and you suddenly get a mental health disorder. It doesn't work like that. The interactions are really powerful in terms of what is quite well established is all those intervening things about the types of behaviors that social media overuse encourages, like losing sleep or not exercising as much, not being as active as you would be because you're just on your phone. All of those types of things are very clearly shown to have an effect on mental health. So it's not necessarily just the direct comparison effect of I want to look like this ideal type on Instagram and I can't, and that harms mental health. Is all these interacting factors which are equally or maybe even more important in terms of, but then obviously you have incredible complexities in so many aspects of our lives affect our mental health, including our economic situation and home resources, home setup, all of those types of things, which also interact with whether you're on social media or not. So it's a complicated area where jumping to conclusions is really dangerous because it may mean that we end up looking in the wrong place. But equally, when you see those types of patterns over time, you've got to look really seriously at the thing that's changed, the thing that we can really identify has changed. So I kind of really, I think that's where we should be focusing on that evidence and beefing up that evidence.
Yeah, so the idea of FOMO, fear of missing out, or FOBLO, fear of being left out, which becomes more apparent on social media. I can see that. Again, on Twitter, I find myself, when I see some of my friends, like, and Steve Pinker's a good friend and Richard Dawkins a good friend, and, when they get interviewed or they're on some special show or, I think, oh, that's really cool. Wait a minute, how come I wasn't invited on that show? Or how come my book wasn't reviewed in that? And then I think, wait a minute, calm down, Shermer. You're in between books. He's on a book tour. You're not. Oh, yeah. Have this internal dialogue, And then when I'm off social media for like a day or two on a family vacation or something, those feelings go away. I'm not even thinking about, what am I doing to advance my career? I'm just having fun with my family. But if I check and I think, oh no, he got invited to that conference. How come I didn't get invited to that conference? So, I'm 67, if I was 15, and I was really worried about status amongst my peers, that would really bother me. I could see how that happens.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's more scope for that. Now. But I guess, a final plea for looking at this in the round. So I think in a couple of ways, the platforms this type of technology is going to stay with us. So supporting people, even if we could manage to change it, the functionality is going to stay with us. So supporting people in broader ways and building resilience to those types of things is got to be a key part of the answer, rather than, again, trying to just take the problem away entirely, and then looking more broadly at behaviors and activities that either cushion people against those types of effects or accelerate those types of effects, like exercise and sleep patterns, all those types of things that are fundamental to our mental health.
Do you think it's too early to give parents recommendations for the amount of screen time for their children per day?
Yeah, I mean, I looked at this a lot for the book, and it was really hard to come to a conclusion because there's a lot of Silicon Valley executives who are very, ostentatiously talking about how their children are only allowed 15 minutes a week, and that's people taking that as a very bad sign about what do they know that we don't know. But the evidence is not very clear cut. I mean, on that there is definitely evidence of working memory impacts from multi-screening and being on lots of doing lots of screens. It's a really interesting effect of how that type of multi-screening approach is affecting working memory, which is about how people, very important to how people learn. Serious academic work on that. But in terms of the screen time work, there is the very big government reviews and meta-analyses tend not to come up with here's a prescriptive amount of time because it's so dependent on what the kids are doing, the other types of support around them, how they're actually using that sort of screen time. So there's nothing that I could find that was like definitively, and obviously it depends so much on the individual and your own assessment as parents of what is good or bad for your kids, that it is a really difficult thing to prescribe, and probably a simple rule of thumb on it is simple rule of thumb maybe is harmful as having just parents approaching it as how do you deal with this sensibly, because there isn't that really clear cut evidence of you do this and this will be the effect, as you can imagine, because it's so varied.
Yeah, especially with those interactive effects between those three different effects you study.
Yeah,
I want to be mindful of your time, Bobby. So let's just go through some of the big issues that you discussed that I find so interesting, like dating, sex, and marriage. Later generations are, having sex later and getting married later. So what are the effects there? And maybe that's not such a bad thing because we boomers were having all kinds of crazy sex and then abortions and divorces, and maybe it's better for not to jump into that too early.
No, I mean, that's definitely an argument for it. You do come to it better prepared. I mean, like, it is the case that divorce is going down, particularly among those younger generations. They come to it more prepared, both financially and emotionally, about where they're going, because they are doing it later. I mean, I think this is part of that bigger trend of delayed adulthood generally, which cuts across sexual behavior, other types of social behaviors. It is seen across different domains, and it is understandable, really, when kids are staying in education longer, they're living at home longer, they're marrying later, having kids later, all of those types of things. It's a delay in life course in many ways, and a lot of the patterns, particularly for millennials, looks like millennials are going to be really, really different from previous generations. And then you roll the data on a few years as they get into their later 30s and early 40s, and actually they come much more into line with previous generations. These differences that look very generational are actually more of a delay than a completely different path that these generations are going down. What's interesting, Gen Z on things like sex does look like a bit of a break from the past, because they are starting, this is on US data, they came into adulthood with 3 in 10 of them not having had a sexual partner in the last 12 months, where for my generation it was 1 in 10. That's quite a gap of that when we were the same age. I mean, that's quite a gap, and they'll have to change their behaviors quite quickly in order to catch up in time to not affect birth rates. If you see what I mean, because you've only got a limited period. You can only delay those types of decisions so far. Medical technology has moved us on, but there is a ceiling on this. So there is that element of actually those types of delays do become a loss in the end if you view it from a birth rate and supporting an older generation point of view. But then there's amazing, hugely hopeful generational breaks on things like smoking cigarettes, where which I found a really interesting one, because it's just so clear to me now, which it wasn't at the time, that all of the measures against stopping people smoking cigarettes had a big component that was generational, not just for the current generations, but was thinking, how do you take cigarettes out of the socialization of the next generation when you grow up? You've got generations now who have no concept of cigarette brands or connection to them in the way that I grew up with. And that's a great thing for health generally. We just lost that connection. So yes, I think positives and negatives in those types of generational breaks.
What about drinking and recreational drugs?
Yeah, drinking is really interesting. It's there is a really clear different relationship with alcohol for more recent generations. Again, we grew up with regular drinking being part of social fabric in some ways, and it's just much less the case for younger generations now. In the UK in particular, there's 3 in 10 of the pre-war generation drank 5 nights or more a week, and still do. Then it's like 2 in 10 for baby boomers, so 1 in 5 baby boomers drinking 5 or more nights a week, and it's 0.2% for Gen Z.
Wow!
And they just don't have that same sense of connection to it. That's not to say there aren't getting drunk. There's binge drinking going on for Gen Z, and all of those types of things are still there. But that very regular relationship, and it's a similar sort of pattern of what you're socialized into. Drugs is more difficult because it's a bit flat, and it depends on which drug you're talking about. But there's no real change. I mean, obviously, cannabis use in the US has increased in certain states, and very variable. It depends on the rules. But in terms of overall drug use, not much of a pattern. Generationally, we've kind of been ups and downs a bit, and you'll see lots of headlines that claim there's a drug epidemic of a particular sort, lung cohort. But it'll be a small year-on-year change that people are turning into a big trend. It tends to go up and down a bit. Drugs go in and out of fashion, and it's not as clear a generational break.
Yeah. Politically, people get more conservative as they get older for obvious reasons. Maybe it's not obvious. Is it because as we get older, we just don't like change as much? So conserving the status quo feels better. And are there cohort effects, generational effects in which, say, Gen Zers are going to be more liberal or more conservative or anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, really interesting politics, because it is such an interaction between all 3 effects. I find thinking about politics in those 3 ways really useful, because you do have that life cycle effect of more conservative as you age. You do have a cohort effect of growing up under a particular type of political party. Does seem to have echoes throughout your life, and that works in both directions. In terms of people who grew up under Nixon tend to get pushed away from Republican, and then but under more successful presidents, you get pulled towards that. You can see those types of patterns. But then, the big story of politics is often period effects, where politicians are living moment to moment, and big things can push them in particular direction. So it's there is definitely a generational cohort effect. And in the US, there's an awful lot of discussion about Darwin coming for the Republicans, or because older generations dying out, and the demography is destiny type aspects. And it's always discussed, and it never quite gets there. You never quite get to the hinge moment of, here we've got complete dominance for Democrats because they've got a younger profile. And that's that's because it's an interaction of all these different effects. It's not nearly as predictable and generational as people sometimes make out. It's really important to understand what the generational effects within that, but it's very far from determinant, and that's where predictions go wrong on politics, is mixing up these three effects.
Right. I just had Jason Riley on the podcast from the Wall Street Journal. He's very conservative. And I said, what's it like to be a conservative in the post-Trump era? And he said, we're not in the post-Trump era. He's still around.
Yes, absolutely.
So I think we're going to have yet another interactive effect is, that because Trump's not really a conservative in the old school way of thinking about what conservatives stand for. So that's, and I almost feel bad for my Republican friends because they, which is our team?
Yeah.
It's the whole thing has been splintered, and that it remains to be seen what the effects of that will be.
Absolutely, yeah, a long time to play out.
Yep. Okay, how about religion? Do people get more religious as they get older, or do generations change? Are there cohort effects?
No. It's very cohort driven. It is connections to religion are one of those things that seem to be socialized into us pretty early on. And America obviously has a very particular relationship with religion compared to other many of the other countries that I look at, which are mostly UK and Western Europe and Canada, Australia, those types of countries. So it's so intertwined with many other social attitudes, and you can kind of explain quite a lot of the other differences between the US and other countries on things like attitudes to homosexuality or women's rights or whatever else by that difference in connection to religion. There is a very slow drifting down within cohorts of religious feeling in the US, but the main effect is cohorts being socialized into different levels of connection to religion, lower levels, step by step, but not nearly as marked as in the UK. So, I mean, when I look at the data, there's a very steep increase in, say, millennials in particular. 3 in 10 of them saying they've got no religion now, and that's the rise of the nuns in the US is a big deal, but that's like tiny compared to the UK, which is 2 or 3 times that level of no religious identification among those younger generations. So yeah, I can understand why the focus is on the rise of the nuns in the US, because it's so embedded into so many parts of society, but still much more religious, even in the younger generations, than the UK.
What is your explanation for the difference between Western Europe and the UK and the United States in religiosity? After World War II, the percentage of Europeans that believed in God and were deeply religious, collapsed. The lines dropped pretty dramatically. But that didn't happen in the United States. And you could take it back further to the secularization thesis, way back in the early 20th century, that as we modernize in public education and the spread of secularism, religion will fall into disuse. And that didn't happen in the United States. Do you have an explanation for that?
Not that. To be honest, Michael, I'm sure you've got a better one than me, having looked at this more than me. I think it stands out incredibly strongly, and I think the reading that I've been doing around the book on it is an unusual mix of that sense of the magic, the magic, and that very practical driven character that you get in the US. It's like a real frontiers type cultural, such a deeply embedded cultural mindset that you get in the US, and they're all intertwined in a way that perhaps you don't get in older countries, where it's a bit more, certainty, I guess, in some ways. But I really don't. I don't know. It'd be really interesting, but it's very clear. And I mean, I suppose the other thing that I'd say is it is while a lot of my data is focused on Western Europe and Anglophone countries, the global trend in religiosity is obviously upwards, and because of less developed nations' population growing and being much more highly religious. So it's really the UK and other bits of Western Europe that are up step with the world more than the US, and it doesn't feel like that. We don't focus on those cultures so much. So there isn't the death of religion is hugely overstated on a global basis.
Yeah, the two explanations I've heard that I like is one, what is the role of religion? Well, it doesn't serve the purpose of explaining the world anymore. Science does that. But religion still has a prominent role in social capital, that is helping the poor, manning the soup kitchens, taking care of people in need. Well, if your government's doing that, most European countries have a pretty tight social safety net. Compared to the United States anyway, we still need religion here because, we have homeless problems and lots of poverty in the richest country ever, and so religion still has a role in that. And the second part is the second explanation is the separation of church and state. So churches here don't get any government money or support, so they have to compete in the marketplace for customers. And therefore, they've ramped up the viability or the interest or the excitement of going to religion. So if you've going to church, if you've ever been to a mega church, oh my God, it's a happening. I mean, it is exciting. I mean, they got rock music and films and goes on for hours, and people are having fun. And they're babysitting for the kids, free parking. So it's kind of a capitalist way of running religion, and so they've kind of kept it relevant there. Now, I know some evangelicals here are wringing their hands about the rise of the nuns, and there has been a drop in evangelical numbers, not dramatically like in Europe, but there is a slight downward trend, and so conservatives are wringing their hands about this. This is going to lead to the moral decay of America. Kids these days. The stuff you talk about. So those explanations. My wife's from Germany, and so she thinks, well, half of it's Catholic, and that the Catholic controversies over pedophilia have really driven a lot of people away. And then yesterday in the news, again October 5th, there was that story about the French Catholic diocese where there was like 200,000 children that were molested. I don't know where they get these numbers. It was like 300,000. It was something huge. And I thought, my God, if they have to pay out, in lawsuits against the church, that could bankrupt the church. Maybe the Catholic Church will just go out of business. Hard to say, but the Vatican would make a nice art museum, I can imagine. And my wife and I like to go to visit cathedrals in Germany, and a lot of them are closed, or they've been converted to like music halls and art museums. And it's like, okay, that seems like a useful thing.
No, they're much better explanations than mine. I can see both of those being really important in explaining that difference. I can see the difference from the UK in very different approaches. Obviously, it's like the same as the US in the sense of it's the more diverse immigrant population that's keeping religion alive in the UK to a large degree, which is it's really the Anglican and Christian religions more generally that are really suffering, really. But then I say that, but it is that our lead archbishop here in the UK talks about actually the median Anglican in the world right now is a black woman in Africa aged under 30, because the religion has just tipped from north to south in global terms.
Right. Yeah, that social aspect of religion is important not to forget. A lot of my atheist friends, like Richard Dawkins, they think, well, if we counter their arguments, the theist arguments, the ontological argument and the prime mover and the fine-tunedness and so on, then people just won't believe in God, and then they won't be religious. I'm not so sure that's the case. I think we could live in a completely scientific worldview and still people would find value in religion. That has nothing to do with that. They're not going to church to hear a lecture about the ontological argument, therefore you should believe in God. That's not why they go, right? So this leads me to my last question for you, and that has to do with happiness, life satisfaction, leading a meaningful, purposeful life. Of course, religion has offered that. But now we have so many more choices that people can find meaningfulness and purposefulness and happiness in other areas of life. How do you think about what's the data show on, and just let's distinguish those, say happiness / life satisfaction versus purposefulness and meaningfulness as maybe two different things, and how those change generation?
Yeah, really interesting. I mean, I think the life satisfaction and happiness point is mostly seen as a life cycle effect from our effects, where you've got your famous U-shaped happiness curve, where it dips in the middle, starts off good, pretty happy with life, and then it dips in the middle in my sort of age, and then comes up again towards the end. And that is pretty consistent. So it's made out to be more dramatic than it actually is. It doesn't mean we're miserable in midlife or that it all completely goes downhill. It might feel like it sometimes, but that view of the most miserable age being around 48 kind of holds up in different sorts of societies. When I look at the data over time, when you plot that generationally, you can see that to an extent. You can at least see younger generations coming into life more happy in a kind of repeated pattern at the same sort of level, and then getting pulled down into the pack, and we kind of move on. And you can also see the kind of rolling ups and downs of life satisfaction around economic and other crises. More interestingly, it's more that crises make us miserable than booms make us happy, and that is a constant of loss aversion and being more likely to notice losses than we are the gradual increases. Plus the fact that lots of people didn't make the economy may have been booming, but a lot of people went better off during those times of boom. So there isn't a big cohort shift in this generation is happier or unhappier than this one, which is really important to distinguish from the mental health point. So there is cohort effects on mental health and on in different countries in different sorts of ways on things like suicide or deaths of despair, as Angus Deaton and Anne Case would call it. There are definite, but they're at the extreme ends of this. Aggregate happiness doesn't really shifted. And then meaning and purpose is also interesting. And there's a lot of myth or exaggeration around younger generations being less interested in meaning, more. There's two groups. There's one that says they're narcissistic and materialistic and less interested in meaning. And there's another group that says they are purpose-driven, all about sustainability and not about things, more about feelings and that type of thing. And there's no good evidence I can find really for either of those being really determinant between the generations. Obviously, young people more materialistic when they're young and they want to be rich, and then it tends to decline over time. You get less interested in being rich, or as you age, and you can see that for Gen X, Millennials, Gen Z, all come in at the highest level of that. And the same with purpose and brand, brand purpose or social responsibility, or all of those types of buzzword type of things. No real interest, no real generationally different interest in those types of brand purpose things, despite what is claimed over and over again in lots and lots of articles, in fact. And then in terms of action, it's in fact the older groups that are more likely to boycott products, not younger generations right now. They're more activist in some ways. The kind of cancel culture in that sense is more of an old middle-aged thing than a young person's thing. The meaning point, I think that is one of the stereotypes that are overblown, that there has been a big shift in either direction on that. I think people are more or less the same sort of balance of immediate goals and these broader goals. I don't think we had this big revolution in either direction that people claim.
Well, Bobby, we've been going well over an hour and a half, so let me just ask you, the reason I like your work is I think it has important implications for policy recommendations. Do you make recommendations to policy experts and politicians and so on?
Yeah, yes. I suppose in this book, it's, I think there's a few specific ones that are around. I don't think you can paint a better future for the next generation unless you sort out housing crisis in the UK, and a big issue in the US, where we've got a very badly working housing market for younger generations. I mean, we just don't see how you can do anything until you take that really seriously for people. But it's part of a broader point of obviously political decision cycles are very short term, and that's one of the big issues here on climate change, on everything else, is we have a very short time horizon on these types of things. And there are some nascent policy and structural responses going on in some countries where we are trying to embed future generation thinking, either through acts, legislation, or through structures like setting up. Wales has got a Future Generations Commissioner, which is supposed to look at all the actions that the Welsh government takes and see what's the effect, not just now, but on future generations. And the European Commission is very interested in that. And some individual countries, like Germany, there was a big feature in recent German elections about how do you start to embed this longer term thinking. And I think that may be the bigger picture story for the next few years, is maybe there's nascent signs that we've got a realization that our short term time horizons for lots of our decisions are just are hurting that sense of future progress, or chance of future progress for generations, which are, our own kids and other people's kids. This is a real thing now, and climate has made that more pertinent to people, but it includes economic aspects and lots of other social aspects too.
Yeah, I love that debunking in your book of about the environment and concern about the climate. And Greta Thunberg, everybody brings up her name. You see the younger kids, they care about the environment, and the old boomers don't care about the environment. Do what you say, Al Gore. End of story. He's an old baby boomer.
Yeah,
right.
Absolutely.
But there, I can see a pathway to doing something about it, carbon pricing and carbon credits, things like that. And, develop nuclear power and electric cars. And, we're kind of on the way to doing something about it. And we can clearly see the pathway. I don't see that for housing. I mean, it's not even clear why housing has gone up so much. There's different economic theories. People bid the price of houses when they go on the market up, and then the younger generations just simply can't afford it. But what do you do about that? I mean, is there tax policy that you could recommend on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a whole package of things. I think you need to be doing it in a packaged way where you make both easier to get out of your parents' home through better regulation of private rented markets. Then I think the financing, a lot of this is about, some of it's about supply of housing and definitely not building enough. But a lot of it is about the financing of it and the stricter rules brought in post-crunch that affect younger people more. So I think there is no one solution to the housing market. I think we need to decide in some ways what we want to do, what we break it down into the individual things that we want to achieve, and then have a package that looks at all of that at once. Because if you do it individually, you just push the problem somewhere else, and that's the big challenge with housing.
Well, Bobby, thank you so much for your new book, and thank you for your work. What's next on your research and writing agenda?
We're working quite a lot on trust. Is our big thing in terms of, and how that relates to values more generally. Trying to debunk the crisis of trust type narrative, while also flagging that there are some issues in specific areas on trust. But again, another sort of slight debunking project.
Yeah, that's super interesting, because that's a big one here with political. Do people trust their political parties or people in the other party? They don't seem to. That seems to be more polarized, but probably not in other areas. I don't know. It's hard to say. In my area, we're concerned about the lack of trust in science as a institution that produces reliable knowledge. And the pandemic has only made that worse. Like, oh, look, they keep changing their minds. We should use masks. No, we shouldn't use masks. Oh, no, masks are back in. Look, they keep flip-flopping. Fauci keeps changing his mind. Well, that's what you're supposed to do in science. When the evidence changes, you change your mind. But in politics, that's flip-flopping. That's a negative point against you.
Absolutely. No, it's a really interesting area. Really interesting. Great.
Yeah, good. Well, we'll have you back on to discuss what you find on that. Thank you so much.
Thank you.